In a long, dim corridor of portraits, the faces of kings and queens stare back, pale, regal, and eerily familiar. Every frame holds the same chin, the same slanted mouth, as if one ghost had worn 100 crowns. The air smells of wax and memory. Here, in the quiet halls of history, you can feel it, the weight of a curse that didn't begin with sorcery or sin, but with love. Love sealed in the same blood. Once, the Habsburgs were nothing more than a small Swiss family with big dreams. In episode 1, The Marriage That Built an Empire, they discovered something deadlier than war: marriage. Each wedding became a battlefield, each child a victory. They didn't conquer with swords, they conquered with vows. But as we learned in episode 2, let others wage war, peace has a price. Their daughters became tokens, their sons offerings. Every union bound them tighter to themselves, and slowly their blood began to thicken into something heavy, something unholy. By episode 3, The Royal Web, the game was complete. Cousins married cousins, uncles took nieces. The royal map of Europe looked less like an empire and more like an inbred family tree folding in on itself. Now, centuries later, their faces remain trapped in oil and varnish. The same jaw, the same proud chin, a deformity once hidden behind velvet and ceremony, now preserved forever as proof that even royalty cannot rewrite the laws of flesh. Each portrait whispers the same truth. We built an empire without strangers, and became strangers to ourselves. Welcome to Underbelly Bloodline, where power, pride, and blood intertwine in the darkest corners of history. If stories like this draw you into the undercurrents of the past, where beauty rots and blood remembers, then subscribe and stay with us, because this is only the beginning of the face that ended a dynasty. In every royal portrait, the same face returned, the same jawline carved like stone, the same heavy mouth pressed tight beneath solemn eyes. Servants whispered of it in corridors. Artists were told to paint it with reverence, not shame. What began as deformity soon became devotion. They called it the Habsburg jaw, a mark of divine lineage, they said, proof that their blood was chosen, their faces sculpted by God himself. But behind the brushstrokes, the truth was quieter, heavier. This jaw was not a blessing, it was a brand. The court painters were careful. They softened what they could, gilded what they couldn't. They stretched reality across silk and pigment, turning pain into power, bone into myth. And in every finished portrait, the jaw jutted forward like the edge of a crown, unspoken, undeniable, eternal. To the peasants, it was majesty. To the courtiers, it was loyalty. To the Habsburgs themselves, it was identity. Even as it worsened, as lips drooped and speech faltered, they wore it with pride, believing it separated them from the common, the impure, the unroyal. There's a kind of tragedy in that, and isn't there? To mistake the mark of your undoing for a sign of your greatness. Generation after generation, the same jaw passed down like an heirloom, a visible reminder of all the invisible damage beneath it. It became their silent signature, written not in ink, but in bone. And the people, they adored it. They saw strength where there was suffering, beauty where there was deformity. Because power, when dressed in silk and ceremony, can make even a flaw look holy. So long as the chin endures, the blood endures. That was the unspoken law of their empire, and the beginning of their quiet extinction. In the grand halls of Europe, weddings were never about love. They were treaties wrapped in lace, alliances sealed with trembling hands. Each ring that slid onto a royal finger bound the same blood to itself again. Every union was a mirror. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces. And though the priests whispered blessings, the heavens stayed silent. They called it purity, the keeping of noble blood unsullied by strangers. But purity, when trapped within its own walls, begins to rot. With every wedding, the Habsburg bloodline grew thicker, heavier, slower. It was no longer an empire built on ambition. It was an empire trapped in its own reflection. The daughters were traded like maps, the sons chess pieces in robes of velvet. Behind the pageantry, beneath the gold and choir song, there was quiet fear. Fear that mixing with outsiders might unravel everything they'd built. But no one saw the unraveling already had begun. Each generation carried the same jaw, the same slurred speech, the same hidden afflictions. Infant coffins lined palace crypts. Brides miscarried again and again. The body was speaking, and no one dared to listen. Their family tree was no longer branching outward. It was folding inward, consuming itself. To marry within the blood was once a choice. Soon it became necessity, because there were no strangers left. Only reflections. The Habsburgs believed they were protecting their divine right to rule, but what they truly protected was the slow, suffocating death of their own humanity. The more they guarded their blood, the less of themselves remained. And beneath every wedding vow, beneath the silks and smiles, a dynasty quietly prepared its own funeral. In the echoing studios of royal courts, the truth was not erased. It was painted over. The Habsburgs understood something few others did, that history remembers the image before the truth. And so, they hired their sculptors of decay, artists whose brushes turned deformity into dignity. Each stroke was an act of loyalty and of quiet deceit. A jaw too long was softened by shadow. Drooping lips were tightened by divine light. The skin of kings glowed not from health, but from the tremor of a trembling artist's hand. The painters knew. They all knew. They saw the trembling mouths, the stiff speech, the eyes clouded with generations of weakness. But their duty was not to reveal, it was to preserve, to keep the illusion alive, even as the blood beneath the crown began to sour. What began as honesty became obedience. What began as portraiture became propaganda. The jaw, once a silent warning from the body itself, became a symbol of divine endurance, a mask painted over pain. For the people, these portraits were more than art. They were scripture in oil, proof that their rulers were chosen by God, not undone by blood. And so, the deformity that should have frightened them comforted them instead. They called it the royal face. They bowed before it, kissed its image, hung it in their homes. And all the while, the artists, the silent witnesses, kept painting. They watched the jaw grow longer, the faces heavier, the eyes emptier, yet they dared not stop. Because in this dynasty, truth was treason, and beauty was survival. The portraits lied so beautifully that even history began to believe them. Behind the velvet and the ceremony, the truth was cruel. The deformity wasn't just cosmetic. It was a slow, private agony written into flesh. Power had carved its price into their bones. The Habsburg jaw, once painted as majesty, had become a sentence. Their chins jutted forward so sharply that lips could not meet. Speech came out slurred, muffled, words tumbling from mouths that could not quite close. Meals turned to humiliation. Food chewed with effort, swallowed with pain. Even the act of breathing for some was labor. And yet the court still bowed. They bowed to the crown, not the body that bore it. They bowed to the symbol, not the suffering that sustained it. Because no one could speak of what they saw. A monarch who could not eat without struggle. A prince whose smile hung crooked and still. A lineage that had mistaken endurance for glory. In the private rooms of palaces, doctors whispered behind closed doors. They called it divine burden, but it was blood crying out for mercy. Each new heir was born frailer, paler, less whole than the last. And still, the priests preached purity, and the painters obeyed. Their bodies had become relics of their own obsession, holy artifacts of decay. Every heartbeat carried the echo of marriages past, every breath, the cost of their own perfection. They had built cathedrals to eternity, but eternity had chosen their flesh instead. The crown was no longer a symbol of dominion. It was a weight-crushing bone and will alike. The body keeps its records, and the blood never forgets. He was born beneath 1,000 prayers, and every one of them went unanswered. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, entered the world already marked. His chin hung heavy, his lips could barely close. Each word he spoke escaped as a whisper through clenched bone and weary lungs. The people called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But his curse was not magic, it was mathematics. Generations of cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, until his blood became a circle with no beginning and no end. He could not chew his food, he could not walk without trembling. He was a king in title, but a prisoner inside his own body. His mouth hung open, his speech slow and slurred, his body small and sickly. A fragile monument to centuries of arrogance. Behind palace doors, doctors gathered like priests around an altar. They bled him, burned him, prayed over him, all to save a body that had already declared surrender. They called it treatment, but it was autopsy, in slow motion. He married twice, but produced no heir. The dynasty that had ruled continents ended with his final breath, a whisper escaping a deformed mouth that could no longer form words. When he died, physicians opened him and found within a body twisted beyond comprehension, his skull deformed, his heart shriveled, his blood thick and dark as ink. They said he had no single drop of pure blood left. Charles II was not a monster. He was the mirror his ancestors refused to look into, the final reflection of a dynasty that mistook divine blood for immortality, and found only ruin. The curse did not kill him, it simply finished its work. They came in silence at first, priests, healers, men of medicine, each summoned to the bedside of a king who could barely lift his own head. Charles II of Spain, pale as wax, his eyes sunken, his breath shallow. Around him, the last great minds of his empire gathered, armed not with reason, but with fear. They bled him to balance the humors. They burned incense to drive away the demons. They whispered prayers into his ear as his pulse faltered. And when faith failed, they turned to alchemy. Mercury, sulfur, powdered pearls, and wine. They mixed miracles in goblets of gold, hoping to rewrite his blood with chemistry and prayer. But the curse they sought to cure was not of body. It was inheritance itself. Every remedy was a plea against centuries of choices. Some said he was bewitched. Others said he was the punishment of pride. But the truth was quieter. A truth too terrible for any of them to speak aloud. This was what happened when a family tried to live forever. They cut his veins and called it healing. They starved him to purge impurity. They filled him with potions meant to strengthen his heart. But the blood that flowed within him was already too tired, too ancient to respond. The doctors wrote their reports in careful ink, but none dared to write what they truly saw, a body collapsing beneath the weight of its own ancestry. They prayed for recovery. They prayed for redemption. But no god answered, because the Habsburg curse was man-made. He was not dying of illness. He was dying of history. Centuries after the last Habsburg king drew his final breath, the whispers of history became measurable. Geneticists, armed with DNA and cold logic, traced the lineage that had ruled Europe for generations. What they found was terrifying in its simplicity. The Habsburgs had collapsed under a weight of their own making. A coefficient of inbreeding so severe, their bloodline was already dead before it ended. Every cousin wedding, every uncle-niece union, every alliance designed to preserve purity did not preserve strength. It concentrated weakness. Deformities like the infamous Habsburg jaw, drooping lips, and slurred speech were the visible echoes of invisible decay. Infant mortality, infertility, and fragile health haunted the family like ghosts, passed silently from one generation to the next. Charles II was not the exception. He was the inevitable conclusion. Each genetic mutation, each repeated bloodline, stacked upon the last, like bricks in a crumbling tower. By the time the last king of the Spanish Habsburgs died, the dynasty's demise had been written into its DNA, a death foretold in bone, blood, and the mathematics of ancestry. Science revealed what courtiers and priests could not see, what painters hid behind gilded brushstrokes. Power cannot outlast biology. And pride, when confined within its own reflection, becomes a prison. They had built an empire spanning continents. They had chained nations to their crowns. And yet, the invisible chains of blood were stronger than any throne. Their bodies, their marriages, their devotion to purity had doomed them long before the world witnessed their fall. History can tell of kings and wars, but DNA tells of inevitability. The Habsburgs did not fail because of enemies or rebellion. They failed because they lived in a mirror, and the mirror slowly became a cage. Beneath layers of marble and dust, beneath centuries of ceremony and silence, the truth waited patiently. Skulls dug from royal tombs reveal it with a precision that portraiture could never capture. The same jutting chin, the same narrow jaw, the same twisted legacy etched in bone. Even in death, the Habsburgs could not hide. Their faces confessed what their gilded portraits denied. Painted smiles, softened lips, veils of power and divinity. all illusions masking a cruel reality. The bone remembers what art forgot. Each skull tells a story of repetition and obsession, of generations trapped in reflection, marrying their own likeness, preserving not strength, but weakness. The jaw that once carried pride now carries confession. The dynasty was doomed not by war or enemies, but by blood itself. Even the smallest features reveal the weight of centuries. Slender frames, fragile spines, twisted teeth. Bones speak in whispers louder than crowns or proclamations. They speak of children who never lived, of rulers who could not eat, could not speak, could not survive. They speak of ambition etched into flesh, and the inevitability that followed. History tries to hide behind gilded halls and golden crowns. History tries to rewrite itself with brush and ink. But the bone remembers, and the bone does not lie. Painted smiles fade, words are forgotten, but the skeleton endures, and in its silence, the truth screams. The Habsburg jaw, a jutting chin, a twisted mouth, a symbol painted, preserved, and whispered across centuries. It became history's cruelest reminder that ambition and pride can carve deeper wounds than war ever could. Empires rise with gold, with armies, with treaties inked in blood. But the Habsburgs built theirs in reflection, a world of mirrors, marriages, and unbroken lines of the same blood. And mirrors, when pressed too close, reflect not beauty, but decay. The jaw endured long after crowns fell. It endured after wars were forgotten, treaties dissolved, and palaces crumbled into silence. In each photograph, each archaeological study, each whispered lesson of history, it speaks. Purity, pursued at the expense of life itself, is not strength, it is rot. Charles II, the last breath of the Spanish Habsburgs, carried the final confession in his fragile bones. But even he was not the end. The jaw became immortal, a ghost of warning for every dynasty that mistakes reflection for perfection, blood for power. And what is power if it cannot endure the flesh it inhabits? What is lineage if it cannot survive its own obsession? The Habsburgs' empire was vast, their reach unmatched, their ambition legendary. And yet, the very pursuit of perfection in their own bloodline sowed the seeds of ruin. The jaw remains, not as a symbol of glory, but as a mark of what happens when pride becomes inheritance and blood becomes prison. The Habsburgs are gone. Their crowns lie broken, their palaces crumble, but the lesson endures, sharper than any sword, heavier than any crown. Empires rot from within when blood, obsession, and vanity conspire. History remembers the face, and the face remembers the blood.